Story of Thomas.
Mary Magdalene knew that.
We talked about the life of John.
We talked about Peter.
Story of Thomas teaches us that we think we know what we know, and yet God wants to prove more than we know. Thomas doubted because the math didn't add up. Unbelief is when you don't believe God can make it work or God can add it up. He had reasons to not believe. He had reasons to not trust. But when faced with who Jesus was, he trusted his doubts instead of trusting his faith. Then when he saw what God could do in his power, he believed.
Mary Magdalene knew that through the cross, Jesus had set her free from her past and from her shame. And in exchange for her very worst, gave her his very best, which is the very essence of the cross. So then, this being true, why would Mary Magdalene not follow Jesus all the way to the cross and beyond? I mean, her vantage point was not one of shame, but one of restoration and freedom. If we know this and we believe this to be true in our hearts, why would we ever cheat ourselves of living a life set free by choosing not to follow him?
We talked about the life of John. While his conversion was amazing, how arrogance plagued him against those on the inside and even against those on the outside. But the reality is when we stare into the life of John, we see ourselves in the mirror. And it's not that pretty of a sight. But John gives us hope. Because John came face to face with the resurrection, with the cross of Christ that puts our pride to death and allows us to embrace a life of humility.
We talked about Peter. And in John chapter 21, you find a man who was supposed to be the rock, who was supposed to be this great leader for the early church. You find him isolating himself away from his calling, isolating himself away from what God wanted him to be, going back to his old name, going back to his old ways. It's because Peter lived on the wrong side of the cross. It sounds a lot like you and it sounds a lot like me. Is it possible that our fascination and focus on the death of Jesus has become an unhealthy thing? Is it possible that our preoccupation with his death has become an actual distraction? Understand, it wasn't the death of Jesus that made the disciples feel alive. No, in John chapter 20, it was the death of Jesus that made them live in fear. It was the death of Jesus that made them roll up a towel in the apartment they were hiding in and hide out all the lights so no one even knew they were there. The death of Jesus left the early church quaking in fear. And until you find the right side of the cross, you'll never move from fear to freedom.
In doubt,
In shame,
In pride,
In the midst of fear,
the cross calls us.
the cross calls us to,
the cross calls us to,
it's the resurrection that
Calls us to declaration.
calls us to freedom.
calls us to humility.
It's the resurrection that calls us to freedom.